Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. As most of you know, we are running a series of webinars to discuss the guidance that's been produced by the Ad Hoc Technical Expert Group on Indicators in terms of how to implement the monitoring framework for the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Today, the webinar will look at one of the headline indicators, which is the indicator related to target 20, which is on data and knowledge. But we're also going to today be discussing how do you build up the underlying biodiversity observation systems that are required across the indicators in the framework. And as many of you know, if you don't have good underlying data sets, then you won't be able to have high quality indicators because the indicators are built upon the data that's underneath them. And so one of the recommendations of the ATEG is really how do we, as a global community, work with countries to make sure that the quality of data and the data collection is boosted across the board. And so I'll hand over to Andy Gonzalez, who is one of the ATEG members. He also is one of the co-chairs of GeoBond, and they've been definitely leading an effort to build up global biodiversity observation networks. And he is also at McGill. So over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Gillian. Thank you for that introduction, and good day, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see the slides. Thank you, Gillian. Yes, I am happy to be your host and one of the participant speakers today in this webinar on Indicator 21.1 and the general preoccupation of building a global biodiversity observing system and supporting nations with their monitoring schemes and networks to provide the knowledge we need to be able to repeatedly update this indicator. I'm joined today by Joji Carino, who is Senior Policy Advisor with the Forest Peoples Program. She is an advocate for Indigenous people's rights and in community national and international levels. And her current focus is on community-based monitoring and information systems, and we're going to hear more about that from her today. And I'm also joined by Walter Yates, who is Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale University, and has been a long-term and long-standing member, active member of GeoBond, and will speak to one of the dimensions of this indicator that was discussed and elaborated during the meetings of the ATEG. So we only have an hour, so we intend to spend about 45 minutes presenting information to you via the slides, and then our intention is to leave a good 15-20 minutes for questions from the participants joining today, and I will facilitate that process of question and answer at the end. So let me start with a few words of context. So target 21 is sort of the target that assesses the overarching knowledge base that we have in terms of the knowledge that's needed to report on progress under all the goals and targets of the GBF. In some ways, it's the target that integrates all that knowledge and allows us to understand how the growth in that knowledge is progressing as nations mobilize the knowledge and information and data they have available, and of course put that towards calculating the indicator for this target. So a quick reminder of what Target 21 is about. It's titled Data, Information and Knowledge for Decision Making, and making sure that that is available. So the idea is to ensure that the best available data, information, knowledge is accessible, keyword, to decision makers, practitioners, and the public to guide effective and equitable governance, integrated and participating management of biodiversity, and to strengthen the communication, awareness raising, education, monitoring, research, and knowledge management. And also in this context, to ensure that traditional knowledge, innovations, practice and technologies of Indigenous peoples and local communities should only be accessed with their free, prior, and informed consent in accordance with national legislation. So that's a very complicated framing for a very important target, and it has many elements to it. And the headline indicator that's proposed for this target 21.1 is an indicator on biodiversity information for monitoring the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I guess that the emphasis there is on one element of this wording of the target, which is the biodiversity information per se. And its current status is under development. And so the RTEG discussed this process of development and the kind of chaperone organizations that will work together over the coming months to sketch out the guidelines, define where the ready data is for countries to use and to update their calculations of this indicator. And the metadata fact sheet is available and has been updated quite recently as at the tail end of the work of the RTEG. So some context. The idea of this indicator is that it should evaluate the availability of biodiversity information for all facets, all dimensions of biodiversity, from genetic, population, species, communities, and ecosystems. And that information is never necessarily required to monitor progress across all the targets of the GBF. We discussed during the RTEG that a single composite indicator may well give an overall summary of status or progress, but in all likelihood, we're going to have to disaggregate that composite indicator in order to assess how these different facets of biodiversity are being represented and the overall access of biodiversity information across those different facets of biodiversity. And because biodiversity information is cross-cutting with other goals and targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework, we think that information used for these other indicators will be relevant to this indicator. And of course, metrics capturing information related to traditional knowledge are at the heart of the indicator. How do Indigenous peoples and local communities assess change in measures of biodiversity per se? Can we fold that in? How do we fold that into this overarching composite indicator? And so the development of a methodology we consider must recognize that many countries have access to national data sets and monitoring schemes for some species and for some ecosystems, but rarely do we cover all the biodiversity information needed for this headline indicator. And so there's a lot of growth that needs to happen, a lot of increasing capacity in order to support this indicator. And some countries may well need access and use of international databases that can then be disaggregated to country levels. So it's this mix of national, local information and knowledge combined with international knowledge that will hopefully allow us to stand up this indicator in due course. And so to think about this in an overarching framework, what we're trying to do with this indicator is to grow the knowledge base from biodiversity monitoring of all types, from communities to regional and to national monitoring, and the support from global and international data, the kinds of data analysis and synthesis we need to be able to do to assess whether this monitoring information is fit for purpose. We use it to be able to assess trends in the indicators we use to track progress under our national biodiversity strategies and action plans, guiding the collection of new data to improve the information flowing into this indicator. And then, of course, thinking about the indicators that we use to guide action under targets 1, 2, and 3 of Goal A, for example, that are focused on planning, on restoration, and meeting our protected area targets. That's an additional type of information that guides action. And so when we think about the scope of this target and this indicator, right now what we're proposing are various sources of information at this left-hand side of this diagram. And this is what Joji and Walter were going to discuss very shortly. So at this point, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Walter. Walter, are you there? Can you hear us?
I think I need to make him a presenter. I apologize. Let me.
Oh, no problem.
Sorry, I didn't see Walter.
No, I don't see him either.
You don't see him in the participants. Okay, in that case, I will advance the slide so that Joji can pick up the the baton. Let me just exit this series of slides and go into slideshow mode again. And Joji, let me pass this over to you now.
Thanks very much, Andy. Okay. I'll speak a little bit about community-based monitoring and information systems and how this contribute to Target 21.1. Yeah. I'll be speaking about the Indigenous Navigator as an existing tool which has already been in use since 2014. And this is primarily data developed and used by Indigenous peoples for Indigenous peoples. And in the next slide, it shows us what are the areas that are being monitored by the navigator. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the key aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals, the outcome document of the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples, and how international rights law has specific linkages to Indigenous people's rights. So currently, it's really a human rights-based approach to monitoring indicators. So it's currently in use in 30 countries and 300 communities, with covering over 300,000 persons. So on the right-hand side, we have the domains or aspects of this which are being covered in the monitoring framework. So, for example, relevant to the GBF would be, for example, cultural integrity, lands, territories, and resources, participation in public life, and in participation, this will actually be highly relevant and would be cross-cutting to a lot of the goals and targets. Employment and occupation, that includes,
sorry.
that's okay. That also would include traditional occupations, which is a headline indicator 9.2. Okay, next slide. Okay, since the creation of the Indigenous Navigator, we have actually been monitoring the traditional knowledge indicators, particularly those linked to CBD Articles 8J and 10C. So in the current tool, we have 63 questions in total, which relate to the 40K indicators. On the right-hand side, we are actually going to introduce new indicators which will specifically monitor goals and targets under the KMGBF. So we are currently in the process of developing an additional module throughout this year, and we'll be ready for data collection by next year. So we already have the identification of the key attributes under the KMGBF that will be monitored, and we have identified the questions that will go into a biodiversity module. Next slide. So this is one page of the website, which contains the countries where data has been collected. So this is open access data, and any of the countries that wish to explore and know what data has already been generated can just go to the website. Okay, next slide. Okay, one of the indicators in the participation indicator under Target 22, this was originally named as trends in degree to which traditional knowledge and practices are respected through full integration, participation, and safeguards in the national implementation of the strategic plan. The wording of this indicator was slightly adapted when we operationalized this. It is now participation in decision-making of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the implementation of the KMGBF at all levels. So participation is actually cross-cutting and linked to all the goals and targets of the framework. This indicator is already operational, and it's available for reporting by parties. In fact, we have a related binary indicator, which will also be reported on by parties in terms of their inclusion of indigenous peoples and local communities in their national frameworks. But the participation indicator is also proposed to be considered as a component indicator applicable to several goals and targets which have been identified. And it is of particular importance for targets 5, 9, and 10 in monitoring progress towards customary sustainable use of biodiversity. Next slide. So we've identified the next steps. So the Indigenous Navigator is already operational, but needs to expand the number of users in countries and communities. The Indigenous Biodiversity module will be completed in 2024, and we expect data to be generated in 2025. And this will include quantitative data on people in traditional occupations. In terms of capacity needs, we actually need to train any of the indigenous partners who wish to use the Indigenous Navigator, and that would require associated financial resources. Presently, the indicator, the tool does not yet address local communities, but the surveys, we have a national survey and community survey can be adapted, so this can include local communities. I think that's it for this particular indicator. Yeah. Oh, just shortly, we've been collecting case studies directly from indigenous peoples and local communities. We already have 2 editions of local biodiversity outlooks, which complement global biodiversity outlook. Next one. Yeah, one more slide. So again, there is an online version of local biodiversity outlooks where you can explore all the data of the case studies that have been submitted, and also the cross-referencing of this data with the previous strategy 2011 to 2020, but we will again do that for the current KMGBF. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joji, for that significant and impressive update. Unfortunately, Walter can't join us today, so I am going to try to present his slides for you all. So allow me to go back a few slides. And so what Walter wanted to contribute today was one of the key elements or composite elements of this indicator, which relates to assessing the gaps in our information. So when we think about monitoring, GeoBond's framework is about assessing the availability of information about different dimensions of biodiversity, both in space and time. And so we can think of this as a data table, or even a data cube, if you think about it in 3 dimensions, that is populated with knowledge that stems from biodiversity monitoring, that is, from local observations that are made in different places around the world. And it's those observations, those local observations across the dimensions of biodiversity, that in conjunction with data derived from other products, so remotely sensed products from satellites, for example, that tell us something about the state of the environment or the underlying environmental condition, which in conjunction with these observations and using models to allow us to assess the uncertainty we have about the state of nature and how it's changing, we can combine these into a workflow that allows us to estimate these gaps, where we have knowledge and where we do not. And so the RTEC considered that there are several dimensions of information that cut across here in columns across all dimensions of biodiversity. So we can think about any country wanting to report under this indicator may want to assemble a database or a metadatabase of monitoring schemes. Irrespective of the level at which that's organized, we may want to assess the overall effort across a country to monitor across these different dimensions. We may want to assess the primary data, that is the raw observations, how complete those observations are in space and time. We might want to also, a country may also want to assess the number of models or the availability of different types of models that can be used to fill gaps and inform the overarching knowledge base. And those models allow us to assess the quality and the coverage of this raw information. And then in turn, what of this information, this high quality information, is being used to support the calculation of the indicators. And we have to be aware that not all information can necessarily be applied to any particular indicators. We're always having to pick and choose the best quality data so that we have confidence in the indicator that we're reporting and the trends that we're reporting of that indicator for any given region or country. And so this information coverage idea is crucial to ensuring quality of knowledge and improvement in the quality of the knowledge over time. So here is one example of growth of knowledge that we have about species occurrences. So where we observe species, these are trends that are available in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And here you're seeing trends in annual global species records over the last 70 years. And you can see for different types of taxa here, the steady growth in those observations that are obviously predominantly pertain to birds and mammals, but we're seeing growth in all taxonomic groups that are available via GBIF. And of course, that is incredible resource that can be used to map those observations and to assess geospatially where we have that knowledge. We can go right down to the level of an individual species. Here, the lesser snouted tree frog, which has a range that's spanning multiple countries in South America. We can see how observations allow us to, combined with modeling, allow us to assess the extent of the species range at this time and at any given time, and over time assess change in the spatial distribution of a species. And given the availability of specific occurrences, in this case there are 17 occurrences, and the model tells us that we should expect to find individuals across, in this case, 256 grid cells in this map, then we can assess the overall coverage, this species information index, that allows us to assess the proportion of cells where we're observing individuals where we'd expect to find them. And we can even do that for particular countries. So in the previous image, we were looking across the entire range, and we weren't focused on any particular country. We can disaggregate that information to give you a calculation of this index by country, in this case for Brazil, or in this case for Argentina. And so by doing that, we can deploy the observations that are available in GBIF and in other data sets, of course, in national data sets, to allow us to assess coverage of information by country. And so here, what Walter is plotting, this is a trend and data set that's available on the Map of Life webpage. And here you're seeing the change in the percentage coverage of this species information index over the last 70 years. And so you're seeing a significant uptick in the availability of this information, the coverage by country since 1980 onwards. And we're heading into the sort of 50% region now in 2020. And this can be broken down, this overall indicator can be broken down into taxonomic groups. And we see again that birds, we're doing very well in terms of our knowledge of where birds are and the observations of birds, of course, because of the significant recruitment of citizen scientists and the veritable explosion in the occurrences that we have available in GBIF. But of course, we're seeing similar upticks for other taxa. There's a dashboard available for this indicator, and the data set is available. This is a screenshot from the dashboard, from the Map of Life dashboard, that allows you to select a country. You see the countries are color coded by the proportion or the percentage of information available for this index. You can see the global average, and you can see the rank of a country, and then you can see how the coverage, species coverage, is trending over time. And so in many cases, because of the growth of knowledge and observations, we're heading to 3 billion observations in GBIF now, we expect to see trends like this in many parts of the world. And Walter's team have been working pretty hard with a number of partners to get to sort of what he calls national customizations of this index that assesses the scope, allows a ready calculation so that can be used in national planning for investment in monitoring activities and monitoring programs. So this is, again, a slide I think he would probably have spoken to our capacity to aggregate and disaggregate. We can even go down to sub-national scales now, and even by protected areas, by overlaying protected area maps with occurrence information, we can assess how well we, how the scope or the coverage of information of biodiversity observations within protected areas and for particular taxonomic groups. So that's a powerful mode of disaggregation that allows us to get some more nuance around this indicator for any given country. So there's some important future steps for this information of coverage, that this is an important component of 21.1. We can think about the importance of linking to other species dimensions, and the RTEC document points to opportunities to do that for ecosystems in particular, thinking about the availability of information in the red list of ecosystems and the burgeoning growth in our knowledge of the distribution, the spatial distribution of ecosystems, but also there's growth in our knowledge of genetic diversity, the spatial distribution of coverage of genetic samples the world over, and we expect this kind of information coverage indicator to reach across occurrences and into these different dimensions of biodiversity. So we had Joji's slides. That was the end of Walter's slides, and hopefully that gave you a taste of what can be done to quantify the percentage availability or coverage of species information. I'm going to fast forward through Joji's slides to the slides that I have prepared. And I want to transition now to thinking about knowledge we have of monitoring schemes. So this is the organizations that we have in place, both informal and formal, that are on a daily basis gathering information across a country. And so we can imagine that a component of this indicator is simply a count of the monitoring schemes that are gathering relevant biodiversity information, including, and these schemes can be used to assess the scope and coverage of the information that's being collected across the entire set of monitoring schemes per country. And so we expect a strong correlation between the number and scope of these monitoring schemes and the information that's available for calculation of the indicator. It's not always necessarily so that information from monitoring schemes is widely available and publicly available, but in general, we would expect there to be a positive correlation. And one of the conclusions of the RTEG was that there was a desperate need for an open global metadatabase of biodiversity monitoring schemes. That it's a little surprising that we don't really know within an order of magnitude, maybe several orders of magnitude, how many monitoring schemes there are around the world, and indeed how many resources, how much information, what kind of levels of human capacity are being mobilized worldwide to monitor the changing state of nature and the contributions and the benefits that we get from nature. So I get to give you an example of a fairly recent paper by Musi et al. In Conservation Biology, where they asked this very question. How many monitoring networks are there worldwide that just focused on population abundances of animals? And they were able to give a range based on an assessment of the literature that places it within 3,000 to 15,000 operational national monitoring networks for population abundances. So the authors obviously point to the value of this knowledge, but it's surprising that we don't there's significant error or margins of error on our knowledge. There's a nice figure in this paper that points to how the number of monitoring schemes has changed over time from the sort of the 60s onwards, and the relative proportion of those schemes by the level of income of different countries. And this cross symbol here tells you the growth in monitoring schemes in megadiverse countries, and this one is in upper middle income countries. So you can see that there are disparities here in the deployment of monitoring schemes by countries. It's changing over time, admittedly, but that we can ask ourselves that there is a great need. We can see that there's a great need to establish a sort of a global understanding or an international understanding of what's mobilized and where. So I want to close with a point that Gillian made at the outset of this webinar, which was it's this raw knowledge, this information that we're gathering from our biodiversity, from our ecosystems, from our seascapes and landscapes, that allows us to assess the growth of information that's feeding into the monitoring framework that allows us to assess progress. And so I think for many countries, there is a need to establish monitoring schemes and biodiversity observation networks that cut across dimensions of biodiversity and, most importantly, across different groups who are contributing to this effort. And so GeoBon has developed this concept of a biodiversity observation network, which is a very general scientific concept that combines social dimensions and natural science dimensions. So any given country that wants to establish a monitoring framework, so here the example is for Colombia, where we imagine a network of sites where observations are being made with different technologies, instruments, knowledge systems that are being mobilized to assess change in any given ecosystem type, and at the same time assessing human impacts, human drivers across those locations. And this process of assembling a biodiversity observation network requires broad engagement, big partnership networks, an assessment of needs, a design of the governance and data management and sampling methodologies that are deployed across the country, and then an implementation of that plan through funding and the partnerships that have been built upstream. And so it becomes this sort of coalescence of activity across a country, across data producers and user groups, and ultimately the delivery of a knowledge service that curates information, makes it accessible where that's appropriate, and ensures that appropriate data analytics are made available to support the calculation of indicators and the communication of the findings from those indicators. We can think of it a little bit like every country has its own weather network. They establish technologies that allow us to assess the change in weather across a country. And we need something similar for biodiversity observations across all countries. And it's those international weather networks that allow us to understand how climate is changing around the world. And in an analogy to that, we imagine that if we have national biodiversity networks working together through a cooperation under an international scheme, that we can assemble a global biodiversity observing and monitoring system that will allow us to get the value added, the sort of this, the whole being more than the sum of its national parts, will give us this picture of the international progress under the GBF's monitoring framework and its goals and targets. And so it's these interdependencies among countries, right? The fact that species ranges or ecosystems cross borders, are transnational, are mediated by drivers at different spatial and temporal scales. That's the biosphere. That's the global understanding that we want to see emerge from national and international cooperation through the establishment of this capacity to this new capacity to monitor biodiversity change. So we conclude that this is an important element for investment and discussion in the coming months as in the lead up to Subster and of course to COP16 later this year. So I'm going to pause at that point and open the floor to questions. And as I do that, I want to just thank all the members of the RTEG and the co-chairs of the RTEG that contributed to the discussions on Target 21.1 and some of the guidelines that we lay down in the text for this indicator that we hope will be picked up and will be widely discussed in the coming months. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Andy. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. While people are getting started, I'll ask a question. I know that you have been working on building national biodiversity observation networks, particularly in the context of Canada. You've been directly involved, but through GeoBond with other countries. I think it would be great if you could describe sort of how this process works, how long does it take, what's going to be required for countries that are trying to do this themselves?
That's a great question, and in some senses, every country is different. Of course, there is a unique biocultural history, a society that is in different societies in different levels of readiness to take on the challenge of building a biodiversity observation network. And the first thing to state is that it is a slow process in the sense that it involves people, that it involves partnerships, it involves organizations in governments, in NGOs, in academia, local communities and indigenous peoples working together to mobilize all of that knowledge. First, there is an assessment of what we have. That in Canada, what we've gone through is several national workshops where there have been open expressions of interest to contribute to the process of establishing a bond, and then broad discussions of next steps in how we can work together, and most importantly, what kinds of resources we have and what do we need. So that first assessment and engagement step is crucial to the robustness of the engagement process. And then, of course, there has to be a close collaboration with the governments that are developing national strategies and action plans, because it's the domestic monitoring framework that is relying on these monitoring systems, on this bond process. And so as these observation networks are being designed and implemented, you're trying to harmonize data streams and the indicators that are chosen under the domestic framework so that we end up with a set of monitoring systems that are fit for purpose. And the critical thing in the next few years is that we mobilize our monitoring efforts within countries to match those priorities under the national strategies, under the NBSAPs. Maybe I'll just finish with this idea that if all countries are following roughly a similar approach to building a bond, that will then facilitate collaboration among nations to create these regional networks. So we have examples like the Asia-Pacific bond, which is an aggregation of multiple countries in the region working together to share their biodiversity knowledge because they share common threats. And we're seeing other efforts like that in South America and in Europe, and increasingly discussions in North America and in Africa about combining countries' monitoring schemes to get these regional outlooks. So my hope, of course, is that some years down the line, we'll have enough of these networks to form the global system.
Thank you. So I'm going to have two questions now that I see. One's in the Q&A and one's in the chat. So people post questions in different places, just for those of you who are trying to follow. The first question is, someone is asking about how you can look at uncertainty. They're asking how this would be in the reporting. In the reporting, it would be optional in terms of the actual national reports, but at the national level, and in terms of how you roll this out, it is really an important issue. And I'll also mention on this that you may wish to listen to the webinar that we did on invasive alien species, which you can find on the website, as there's a great example there on how collection effort is directly related to the results that you see. And so you can have very different results depending on whether or not you are taking into account the effort that you're making. And then I'll just ask the second question as well, which is how do you bring satellite data into these biodiversity observation networks? So I will.
Okay. I'll start with the first one on uncertainty. This is a critical question, and in fact, I think needs much more focus in general. In the early stages of as countries are trying to assess what they have, and they're acknowledging that some uncertainty comes from the gaps, and that's a very straightforward way of assessing uncertainty. But what we realize is that the uncertainty comes also from the degree to which we deploy the effort, as Gillian just said, that goes into calculating an indicator. Is that the uncertainty we have about the measure of an indicator depends on the time and investment we have in observing different dimensions of biodiversity. In fact, there's a very strong correlation between uncertainty and the effort that we put into measuring it. Now, the effort has to be structured according to patterns of change across a country. So not all rates are equal across a country. So some areas need more focus than others. And we also know that drivers, human and natural drivers of biodiversity change, are spatially variable. So sometimes we have to be smart about how we structure our sampling effort. Now, in a designed monitoring scheme, we take that into account, and we have to take that into account. And those systematic observations we now realize can be combined with more opportunistic or observations made by citizen scientists, or what we call unsystematic observations, and that fill the gaps. And so now there's a new wave of models, like the IAS models, that allow the invasive alien species webinar that Gillian was referring to, that these models allow us to take on board these different sources of uncertainty, combine them into the model, and then it gives us a best estimate with some measure of error. There are different frameworks for doing that, but allows us to assess or partition the sources of uncertainty. So we can then be more strategic about where we would invest in sampling, in modeling, to sort of get a better handle on the trend and the veracity of that trend, ultimately the confidence we have in the trends that we're seeing. And in conjunction with the models, the second question that Gillian asked me to consider is obviously the information, the complementary information we can get from Earth observations. That remote sensing indeed can provide a kind of wall-to-wall scan of the state of certain properties of ecosystems and populations, not all, of course, but it allows us to fill the gap, in particular around environmental drivers, around the integrity of ecosystems, measures like connectivity and other indicators of the GBF can be supported with monitoring information, Earth observation. So really, the uncertainty, we have to be quite explicit about the different sources of information that we have available and how they all contribute to our knowledge of change.
Thank you. I will first ask, I see that James has his hand raised. For those of you who aren't aware, James is the co-chair of the Ad Hoc Technical Group on Indicators. And so I'll hand over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Thank you, Andy, for great presentation. Thank you also, Joji, and I'm sorry Walter wasn't able to join us. Some really good stuff in that, and I think it's really important to think about this in the round. I'll just pick up on a couple of points you've just made, and I've then got a couple of observations or questions of my own, if I may, please.
Fantastic.
The first one, in terms of the availability of data, don't just think space, think remote observation overall. So different types of remote sensing provide different types of data and are useful in different circumstances. So LiDAR data or drone data or aerial photography data, all sorts of different ways of gathering data without necessarily feet on ground. Ground truthing often necessary. So really bringing that back to the reality is important. In terms of the questions and comments I was going to make, I think there's a question that it would be really good to address, Andy, in terms of the sort of opportunities to focus on issues of national interest and importance when developing bonds in a global context, and being clear about the sort of how does this fit in terms of what's in it for me versus what's in it for somebody else. I think there's a point about the extent of necessary involvement or not necessary involvement of national statistical systems. And I think that there's also a point about transparency in data provision, particularly when you start to come into intellectual property rights, and certainly some of the indicated work that I've been involved in the UK, we publish the data that we're graphing, but we don't necessarily publish the underpinning individual observations, which could be literally millions. So there's a sort of scale of what's reasonable to put out there, but also to respect the confidentiality in some cases of locations where you're able to bring in a broader trend. And just to pick up on that data analysis point that you were making, we literally are able now to, from the unstructured observations, to be able to come up with trends for something like 6,300, 6,500 species, whereas from structured monitoring, we're able to come up with something like 650. So it's literally an order of magnitude more, which is massive in terms of being able to get a better picture of change in the environment.
Absolutely. And to that point, just working backwards, I think that that there's a genuinely a revolution occurring in our capacity to observe nature, and we need all sources of information right now and recognize that role. And I think we can be pretty clever now about how you combine systematic and unsystematic observations into an overall assessment of change. I think that there's going to be significant progress of that over the coming years. Your point around transparency of data and rights of access are critical to the wording of this whole target. And the importance of, we talk about fair and care principles, the sort of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable is one dimension of this. But of course, the sort of the collective benefit, the authority to control, responsibility, and the ethics of how data are used and shared is critical to the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And I think that is both, that has dimensions of intellectual property rights, but also has dimensions of just basic rights of people to be in control of the knowledge they have about the ecosystems they live within. This is really important component of what Joji was speaking to, and that Indigenous Navigator is going to be a significant resource, I think, in the coming years. This critical point around bonds being fit for purpose doesn't mean they're identical everywhere. It means that, yes, countries have every country is different in terms of its ecological or biodiversity history, but also the preoccupations of the factors that are driving change in countries will vary significantly. And so what's important is that each country has a system that meets their immediate needs. But if we're clever, we can have our cake and eat it. We can design monitoring systems that allow a minimum or like a backbone of common knowledge that's shared by all monitoring systems. And there we can hope to aggregate that learning among and across monitoring systems that allow us to get these powerful regional and maybe even continental wide assessments of change that will only serve to support the monitoring framework over time. Obviously, the preoccupation right now is with the national level and standing up national systems. But as I said, if we're clever about it, I think we can do it in a way that gives us much more from that process. And so to your point, yes, let's design the systems that countries need. Let's find the means to support the national bond process and do it in a way that's smart to allow international collaboration.
Thank you, Andy.
So I think there's one more question that I see in the chat. Andy, you touched on this in your presentation on the existence of like the AP bond. So I guess that I'll broaden this question out is, where do you see the utility of regional or national level work? How do you build the capacity of governments to process data, but how do you also perhaps leverage regional collaboration so that you can bring everyone up together? Thanks.
Wow, these are massive questions. I think the AP, the Asia Pacific bond is a good example because we recognize that countries share similar threats, whether they are climate related. For example, climate does not stop at the border of a country. The climate events span multiple countries, and ecosystems have to respond to those events, whether they are extreme storms or fires or other related climate events. But also, crucially, that through global trade, we realize that drivers, indirect drivers of change, how markets are working, how we're moving not only organisms around, but how goods and products are being produced, means that we're all coupled into this regional and international system. So if we're going to monitor outcomes, we need to be aware of the interdependencies among countries, regionally and internationally. And it's by being aware of those links and connections that we'll be able to deploy measures, legislation that is at that scale, at that appropriate scale. So it's being aware of the sort of the multi-level dimension of biodiversity change, I think, is really, really important. And I was just last week in Europe. I was in Finland and in Estonia, where I was listening to talks from the Biodiversa Plus program, where European money had gone into funding transnational monitoring projects. And it was remarkable to see the collaboration that was happening among countries. One particular project was the deployment of a bioacoustic survey from Norway to Portugal. Wow. You know, that kind of scope of being able to gather knowledge and to cooperate at that level is game changing, I think. But it can't just be in the Northwest, you know, hemisphere. It can't just be in Northern Europe. Those are the kinds of systems and approaches that are deployable in different parts of the world. So I think that that is crucial, that we save a little bit of our money it's going into the GBF for these regional and international systems. So they're going to give us that extra value that we'll get from designing a global monitoring system to match the monitoring framework of the GBF.
Thank you, Andy. So I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I think we can wrap up. This to me it's really the foundation of building monitoring systems, and so it's great to hear all the work that's being done. However, I think the more that you talk, the bigger the challenge becomes, because there really is a challenge in terms of ensuring that we have the information that we need. So that we can turn the tide. And I will say, yesterday someone sent me, a position paper for SAPSTA 26, and in that position paper, it was just an academic type institution that sent us. They said, that they believe that monitoring is the foundation for the global review and for the achievement of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And I think this is really true, which hopefully justifies the investment, but it also does present the challenge of making sure that we're not in the same situation in 5 years where we still don't have the information that we need. So with that, I will conclude. I would encourage everyone to check out the other webinars that we will be having. There will be additional webinars this week and next week. And so please feel free to join us for different sessions on different topics.
Thank you, Gillian, and thank you to Joji. Thank you to Walter for his slides, and thank you to all for your questions. We're making progress. Our glass is half full. Let's keep up the effort.
Definitely half full and filling. Take care.
Thanks,
everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.